Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Schwartz, the Executive Director of the Association for Comprehensive Energy Psychology, and I am with Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. He is the progenitor of the idea of Morphic Resonance. He is the fellow of the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Schumacher College. His classic book is A New Science of Life, which now is retitled, I guess, in its third edition, Morphic Resonance. His latest book is, depending what country you're in, either The Science Delusion or Science Set Free. Hi, Rupert. How are you?
Hi, Bob. I'm very well.
So for those of folks who maybe don't know your work quite well, could we just start off with a brief introduction to Morphic Resonance and Morphic Fields?
Sure. I started out in my research career at Cambridge working in developmental biology, particularly on plants. How do plants develop? And I came to the conclusion fairly soon that chemicals alone can't explain this, molecular biology. Genes code for proteins, the sequence of amino acids in proteins. They don't code for the shape of a petal or the shape of a feather on a duck's back or anything like that. They have a very limited role. And already within biology at that time, in fact, since the 1920s, there was a concept of form-shaping fields, morphogenetic fields. Morphogenesis is the coming into being of form. I got interested in this field concept. I didn't invent it. And it made sense to me that these fields are like an invisible plan or blueprint of the organism that shape the developing organism. They're within and around the organism, just like a magnetic field's within and around a magnet. But they're not a kind of field that science already recognizes. Now, all this was already there when I came on the scene. No one knew what they were, these fields, and most people said, oh, well, this is just a word, and in due course it will turn out to be regular physics and chemistry and molecules. But it's just a placeholder for what we don't know. Some people thought the fields must have eternal equations, kind of Platonic equations that explained them. But I felt that the fields must evolve because biology evolves, and that's where I came up with the idea they have a memory. And that's really the essence of morphic resonance, that all self-organizing systems, including plants and animals, have organizing fields, morphic fields, which are what make the whole more than the sum of the parts. And that these fields have a shape, a structure, a pattern, which is why they shape developing organisms, embryos, and why they underlie the activity of the nervous system. They give pattern or form to the activity of the brain and the nervous system. But they have a built-in memory, and the process is called morphic resonance. Similar things influence subsequent similar things across space and time. In essence, what I'm saying is that each species has a kind of collective memory. Every baby giraffe, while it's an embryo, draws on a kind of collective giraffe field, which shapes its form as it develops as an embryo and as it matures into an adult. And it also inherits a memory of behavior from previous giraffes, which gives it its instincts. So inheritance involves both genes, which enable organisms to make the right proteins, and morphic resonance, which helps to shape their bodies and underlies their instincts. So that's the hypothesis in a nutshell. And in its most general form, what it says is that so-called laws of nature are more like habits, that the whole universe has a kind of memory.
Wow. So let me make sure that folks are getting this. Part of what you're saying is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that genes don't account for the fact we all have the same. Let's take humans. We all have the same genes. Every cell has the same genes. So biology has no information to date. The science of biology has just no good explanation about how your nose knows to be a nose, among other things, and your knee knows to be a knee.
Exactly. I mean, the genes in your arms and legs, for example, are the same, and the proteins in your arms and legs are the same, but your arms and legs have different shapes. What the proteins do is give the right building materials for the body, the right enzymes as well. but they don't give the shape. It's a bit like a building. If you think of the building plan for a building, with the same timber, the same bricks, the same cement, you could build buildings with different shapes, different building plans. And the building plan isn't in the materials. It's what organizes the materials, or the basis of their organization. So the morphogenetic fields are what shape the form of the body and underlie its regenerative capacities. The proteins, you have to have the right proteins to get the right body. If you have a defective protein, you have a defective body. You can't make a particular enzyme, for example. Just like if you build a house out of defective bricks, the house may not have the normal shape, but that doesn't prove the bricks are what determine the shape of the house, that you obviously need the right ones to get the right shaped house.
So what's, I think, interesting for people in the practice of energy psychology, energy medicine, energy healing is, again, it's energy, and energy is often defined by fields. Einstein's, says, all the, what's really important is what's in the field. So that's partly why, you're on, we're talking to you, because you have this interesting idea about how fields contain information that then act to inform our growth, and learning and memory as well.
Yes, well, I mean, what modern science tells us about the nature of reality, physical reality, is that it's a combination of fields and energy. Energy is what makes things happen or change. It gives them actuality and activity and movement, but fields are what shape the energy. So the energy itself doesn't have form. I mean, the energy in an electric plug socket can be used to power a toaster or a hairdryer or a TV set or a computer. It can do all sorts of different things, just like the energy that you and I get from our food can do different things. I mean, somebody else could have eaten the same food you had for lunch and come and had very different thoughts and done very different things. So fields and energy go together, and the way that the energy is organized is by the fields. So it's hard really to separate energy and fields. Fields organize energy, but without energy, you would have no activity, no actuality.
Right. So, when your work came out originally, it was pretty controversial. We'll get to the I mean, a lot of people are very upset by what you're saying. We'll get to that in a minute. But it's been a bunch of time since it first came out. Where are we in, and I've said elsewhere in these talks that, science is itself developmental. It has, it changes. What we thought last year or 10 years ago is totally different now. Where are we in scientific inquiry and scientific knowledge regarding, are there new changes? Is there new data about that lends support to your ideas or disrupts your ideas? Or
Yes. Well, in the 1980s, when I first published this idea of morphic resonance, most people were convinced that within a decade or two, molecular biology and sequencing the genome would enable all the problems of biology to be solved, at least in principle. They were enormously optimistic, and that's why people spent billions of dollars on the Human Genome Project. They thought it would be completely transformative for our understanding of human nature. I never believed that, because I always thought genes are grossly overrated. People think that they do a lot more than they really do. When the Genome Project results were published in 2000, most people were shocked to find that instead of 100,000 genes, there are only about 23,000. We have far less than those of a rice plant. We're not way up there in sort of large numbers of genes. We're way behind quite a lot of other animals and plants. That was the first shock. And then the idea was that everything inherited is genetic. You couldn't have an inheritance of acquired characters. I was saying, on the contrary, that you can. If rats learn a new trick, rats all around the world should learn the same trick quicker because of morphic resonance. There's already evidence for that. Around the year 2000, the taboo against the inheritance of acquired characteristics broke down. the whole phenomenon was rebranded epigenetic inheritance. People found that what's happened in past generations can affect what happens now. And what's more, this can happen really fast. This has huge implications for our understanding of evolution. Neo-Darwinism is based on the idea that there are just random changes accumulating over many generations. One study done about a year and a half ago shows you how far science has moved now. In the study, male mice, were conditioned to avoid a particular smell, acetophenone, which is a synthetic chemical that they'd never meet in nature. And they were given electric shocks when they smelt it. So not surprisingly, very quickly, they became frightened when they smelt acetophenone. They then took sperm from these male mice, inseminated female mice with it, artificial insemination, so that they never met the males. And then tested their children. And the children and the grandchildren of the male mice that had been frightened by acetophenone were terrified when they smelled acetophenone. An aversion to a particular smell had been transmitted to the offspring and to the grandchildren in a way that couldn't possibly be explained by cultural transmission, because the males never met the mothers. This was artificial insemination. So what's going on? We have something that's completely impossible according to standard neo-Darwinism, the inheritance of behavior in a single generation. Now, no one knows how that epigenetic inheritance is working, and I think that it involves a component of morphic resonance. Morphic resonance predicts that kind of effect. Epigenetics at the moment is respectable within science because people say, well, there must be a molecular mechanism. In a few cases, they've found molecular changes in the methylation of the DNA or in the proteins that bind to the DNA. But epigenetics is now this booming area of science, which is changing everything. A paper came out just last week on plant science with the plant Arabidopsis, showing that there's a major amount of epigenetic going on there. And as they point out, this would completely change our views of how evolution works. So biology is in a state of flux at the moment, more than I've ever seen it before.
That's great. Let me ask, so let me, well, at some point we'll get the citation for that article. That sounds fascinating. So, you know, that article could, the mechanism could be biologic since they are, you know, this could be the standard is some methylation. Have they done the next step and somehow found a way to say, okay, let's take some mice? I'm sort of thinking of the work of Bill Bankston, you know, who says,
Yes.
so we get a bunch of mice, put them together, but they're no relations. We shock the mice, this mice, but then we look at the offspring from his brother or something.
Yes.
But there's no possible way.
Yes.
It could be chemical or biologic. Has that been done yet?
No, that wouldn't be part of the existing paradigm. And even though some people working in that area might want to try it, that would be a very dangerous and taboo experiment to do, because that would point towards morphic resonance. I haven't actually published anything about morphic resonance and epigenetics because I don't want to put these people off. They're doing great work. And if I jump up and down and say, look, this might be morphic resonance, the skeptics are going to come down on them like a ton of bricks and they'll back off. And I think it's much better that they carry on doing the research they're doing. And they can't explain this mouse phenomenon in molecular terms. They'll try, and there may be molecular changes, but at the moment, I think it's, I think that the morphic resonance aspect will come out later. I think if anyone tried to do it now, the whole field would become sort of much more controversial than it is. And I think it's better they proceed without controversy until there's a lot more data.
This sounds like wisdom talking to me. You're now, you know, all in its time.
Yes, I've been at this involved in this for a long time now, since the 1980s. In fact, I first thought of morphic resonance in 1974 73. And I've learned enough about the sociology of science to know that there are very strong taboos. People are motivated by fear to a very large degree. That most scientists are much more open-minded in private than they can be in public. And I do know that some of the people working in the epigenetic area are privately open to the idea of morphic resonance. I'm in correspondence with them, but they can't say that in public, and I can't reveal their names in public because
right,
their grant's shut off.
Which is really the issue. It's you know, the old follow the money kind of idea.
Yes, it is. And what would really change science is a radical alternative funding source. And let me just mention now in parentheses, one has just started up. The appeal for pre-proposals is in mid-April. This is the Institute for Venture Science. And it's an organization run by Gerald Pollack at the University of Washington. It's based on the perception that nothing very radical can get funded in science at the moment because of this extreme conservatism which inhibits innovation. And the Institute for Venture Science has managed to get some funding, and they're only funding research which is radical and innovative. They're not going to fund more of the same. And they're just about to launch a call for pre-proposals, 2-page pre-proposals for paradigm-shattering research. I'm one of the people on the review board for this, and I'm really excited. This is the first time that anything's actually happened which could really shake things up. If, as I expect, some of these proposals lead to serious new breakthroughs, then more funding would flow in this direction. This is, of course, coming from private sources, not government ones.
So if there are any billionaires listening to this and they want to put their money into some radical ideas, but have it properly, you know, managed,
yes,
this might be a good place for them to do that.
Absolutely. IVS, the Institute for Venture Science.
That's great. Well, this might be a good place to segue into, and we're going to cover a number of areas. You did put out this, you know, talk on the science delusion and on the TED Talk, and it got banned, and it really fired off a major storm. Perhaps you could say a little bit about that. I guess from the perspective of, you know, a lot of folks doing energy healing are sort of in the, you know, they're perceived as to be in the woo-woo, and there's no science behind it. So, you know, maybe how this is relevant for that. And then perhaps after that, we could talk a little bit about, you know, what you perceive as, at least from your work, you know, some of the science that does support energetic aspects of healing. Or do that first, if you'd like.
Well, now I'll talk about the TED Talk first. I was asked to give this TEDx talk in London. And when they asked me, I refused because I don't like TED as an organization. I mean, they put across ideas. They don't pay their speakers anything, and they make 20 or 30 million a year from these big conferences where people pay a lot of money to go. So I don't like the business model of paying innovative content providers nothing and the corporation getting everything. So I said no, but it turned out the girls organizing it were friends of my son. They were at university with him. And so I then had my younger son come to me and say, you said no, these girls are my friends. I'm doing a gig at the same thing. Can we? So I said, oh, all right. So I was persuaded by my son to do it. So I did it. It went online like all TEDx talks, or most of them. I thought that was it. But then 2 or 3 months later, I was traveling in India at the time, and I started getting emails from people saying, you know, don't let them get you down. This is an outrage. I didn't know what they were talking about because I only had very intermittent email connections. Then I learned that this talk had been suppressed from the TED main website as a result of complaints from militant atheists, Jerry Coyne and P.Z. Myers, who'd written blogs denouncing TED for allowing me to have a platform to put forward my ideas. And foolishly, they suppressed this talk. They took it off their website, and this caused a tremendous furore. I had nothing to do. I was in India at the time. Only every 2 or 3 days did I manage to get a connection where I could sort of see what was happening. And by the time I got back to Britain, this was a big thing. And the head of TED, Chris Anderson, emailed and said, could he call me? And so he did. And it was clear they were seriously worried about reputational damage, etc. Anyway, they didn't restore the website, the talk to their website, but by then it was all over the internet on all sorts of other sites. They couldn't suppress it. When they banned it, it had had 35,000 views. It's now had at least 2 million. So this has in fact fanned the flames of controversy. It's publicized this talk in a way that, you know, the best PR agent couldn't possibly have dreamed of. I mean, it's been a tremendous gift from the publicity and propagation of ideas point of view. So I don't hold any grudge against TED. And I think that Chris Anderson now realizes it was a big mistake. In fact, he got so many protests that he told a journalist fairly recently that he'd actually bought my book and read it and thought I was making some really good points. So the whole of this banning thing backfired horribly as far as TED's concerned.
Okay, so it's interesting of unintended consequences. There's this great Taoist story about the guy who's loses his horse, but then the horse comes back, and everybody says good luck and bad luck, and it turns out you just have to see how it unfolds. So tell me a little bit about, from your perspective, the science, the data, studies that support, that might be of interest to people doing energy healing, or just your take on it. I'm curious how you see it.
Well, my take on it really comes from the most fundamental level at which I'm thinking of is the self-healing and regenerative capacities of all organisms. Regeneration, you can cut a willow tree into hundreds of little bits, and each cutting can become a whole new tree. Flatworms, cut them into little bits, each bit can become a new worm. We have tremendous regenerative capacities. Wounds heal, the liver regenerates. We're constantly regenerating skin and intestinal lining and hair and nails and so on. Now, I think this is part of the way all organisms are, and our human ancestors were healing from all sorts of things long before the American Medical Association was thought of, or doctors of any kind came into being. I mean, the first ones were probably shamans and herbalists, but apes, chimpanzees don't have doctors, and yet they heal from, not always, I mean, not all, even American medicine cures all diseases, otherwise no one would ever die. So no medicine's perfect. But I think we have a deep self-healing capacity, and any form of disturbance, mental or physical, there is a capacity to heal it. I see most forms of healing, conventional and unconventional, as working with this self-healing capacity. I mean, after all, even the most advanced surgery fixes some things, but you've still got to heal from it. If you have a hip replacement, you've still got to heal from it. And people have to do physiotherapy and so forth as part of the recovery process. And that's the body itself. When it comes to the various forms of energy medicine, I don't know how they will work. I don't know that anyone really knows how they work. But I think the best way to do scientific research on any kind of medicine is pragmatic. Does it work? I don't think there's much point in double-blind, placebo-controlled trials, because the placebo effect, which used to be regarded as a nuisance, is now widely regarded as a major part of the healing process, even within conventional medicine. A lot of it depends on placebo. A lot of drugs like Prozac depend on a placebo effect. even a lot of surgery seems to have a placebo effect. So I'm not very interested in what's placebo and what's real. I'm interested in what works. And that's why I think that the best form of medical research is based on comparative effectiveness research or outcome studies. And the outcome studies that have been done in some areas of energy medicine look to me pretty impressive. It's interesting that now, at least here in Britain, the evaluation of medical research is moving more and more towards outcome studies. We have something called the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, NICE, which advises the National Health Service. Because we have a public health system which is always too expensive, the government is always trying to cut costs. And they're not driven by ideology, they're driven by economics. And NICE recently found in controlled trials that for people with moderate to mild depression, they got better more effectively and stayed better longer if they did mindfulness meditation than if they were prescribed Prozac or other antidepressants. And more important from the NICE point of view, it turned out to be cheaper to teach them meditation. This is now official government policy in Britain, recommended by NICE, and you can now get psychiatrists to prescribe mindfulness meditation on the National Health Service free. Because it's been shown to work and work better than the conventional cure. Now that seems to me a model. So many people in energy medicine claim to be able to treat post-traumatic stress disorder, and I know that there's been research by the Veterans Administration funded by them on this. There seems a clear case to me, you know, does this work better than the conventional available methods, and is it cheaper? And it seems to me that if it works better and if it's cheaper, then I can't see any possible reason why anyone would not want to do this.
Well, ironically, of course, that's not what's happening yet. I mean, there has been research, and it is these, you know, much better, quicker and cheaper and more effective, and still has not been accepted in any major way. But I think, as you've said, there are politics. There are however that goes. Sooner or later, the hope is that it finally will win out.
Well, I think so. I think one of the things that's really changing thinking at the moment is new research on the placebo effect. There's a book I'm reading at the moment. It's just come out here in Britain. It's got very good reviews. It's written by a conventional science journalist. It's called Cure by Joe Marchant. And what the book does is looks at many examples of where people get better unexpectedly from the point of view of conventional medicine in ways that would just be labeled the placebo effect. But what she shows is there's now research shows that the placebo effect involves actual changes in the brain. It's not just kind of some wishy-washy, all in purely subjective thing. It involves physical changes. There's now very good research that people, including animals, can be conditioned to produce antibodies in response to a placebo. You know, psychoneuroimmunology, all these kinds of things. And the effects are so powerful for many conditions that the big research questions that are now, as she shows convincingly in this book, the big research questions that are being asked now is not, is something better than a placebo, but what's going on in the placebo effect? Why is it that our belief, our expectation can have such big effects on our healing process? And how can this healing modality be improved and made more effective and made to work along with other forms of medicine? So it's no longer real drugs versus phony treatments that just give a placebo effect. It's placebo effect's a big part of it all the time, and some treatments unleash it more effectively than others, and therefore work better as cures.
So that you've just anticipated where I was about to ask you a question, which might seem a little radical or upsetting maybe to some of the folks listening. Is it possible from your perspective then, or maybe we should just think about it this way, that energy medicine approaches, what makes them so good is that they are fantastic elicitors of that which has been called placebo effect. Maybe, you know, that they are better than something about the ritual of hands near, hands on, the love, the care. I don't know, whatever it is, what the mechanism is, but something about it. And maybe it's the morphic field because it's something, it's eliciting something back in generations that says, okay, this will make the body, you know, this engage self-healing mechanism, which for ways we don't even begin to understand, AKA the placebo effect.
Well, yes, I think so. You see, because I think what has come to be called the placebo effect is very much to do with the self-healing capacities of the body. All, as I said earlier, all forms of healing rely on these ultimately. Even surgery, which is the most physical. I suppose the thing that relies on it least is dentistry, because if you're putting in a filling into a hole in a tooth, then that's the closest you can get to a purely physical treatment.
Or setting a broken leg, maybe, or...
Well, no, even the setting the broken leg, you see, you can put the bones in the right place, but what makes them heal is a self-healing process.
Yeah.
You can help it by setting it, but the actual knitting together of the bone is because of an active physiological process.
Right.
I think almost the only thing that would be totally mechanistic would be, you know, fillings in modern dentistry. I mean, a marvelous thing. I mean, it works, and thank goodness for dentists. But even surgery depends on this self-healing thing, you see. And the way people respond to surgery and the way they get better from it depends on their state of mind. If they're depressed, they don't recover as well as if they're not depressed. So even in surgery, placebo effects. In fact, recent studies involving sham surgery have shown that these are much stronger than anyone ever believed in the past. And so people's expectations are really important. And you see, you can look at the placebo effect or healing effects the other way around, that instead of the healing placebo effect being seen as something that makes you get better in a rather mysterious way, you can ask the question, well, why don't you get better anyway? What is it why does the placebo effect work at all? It suggests that something is inhibiting the self-healing approach. The placebo effect
that's interesting.
Releasing the self-healing. Now, my friend here in Britain, Nicholas Humphrey, who's a psychologist, came up with, I think, a fascinating theory of this, that if you think of an animal in the wild and it gets a disease, then should it throw everything it's got, the entire immune system, all its healing capacities at this disease or at this wound or whatever problem it's got? If it throws everything it's got, which takes energy and resources, what happens if something else happens? It gets another injury or another disease, or gets into a fight and gets some septic scratch. If it's used up all its reserves, it won't do so well. So his idea is that, evolutionarily speaking, animals that feel under threat, and most animals feel under threat to some extent most of the time, are not going to put everything they've got into the healing. They're going to hold something back. And the more threatened, the more they may feel they have to hold back. And the placebo effect happens to humans, and probably to animals as well, if they feel safe, secure. So say you're in a clinical trial, you're in a hospital, there's people in white coats, they're looking after you, getting regular food, the heating's working, your family come and visit you, there are people praying for you, you feel safe, secure. The inhibitions of healing are removed, and that it releases that healing capacity. Now, I suspect that some forms of energy medicine are doing just that, that some people have had experiences that have closed down their healing capacity. Traumas, for example, may have meant that they're hypervigilant and always holding something back because something dreadful could happen at any time. And by closing down, some people have it more closed down than others. And anything that can release that self-healing capacity will have a healing effect. And call it a placebo if you like, but I would call it a healing effect. Placebo is one form or one name we give to healing effects. So I think when we look at why is it closed down, then the placebo effects make much more sense. So I really like Nicholas Humphrey's theory of this.
I think that's fascinating. So let's see if I can restate this to make sure I have this and maybe put my little twist on it. But if I'm, especially as it relates to energy healing, so there could be current stresses, and there also could be, you know, stuff we carry with us, the traumas and wounds and stresses of the past that we keep in our unconscious and that just sort of operate. When you go to an energy healer, where somebody adjusts your chakras or does energy psychology and taps on traumas and clears those traumas, that's the, you know, then you're releasing stress, that some internal, you know, we use the word stress, and then that then allows, it's the stress that makes you have less capacity for healing.
Exactly.
And those resources are now freed up to go into the natural self-healing process that we all have.
Yes, exactly. Well, you see, I think that this makes tremendous sense. It fits with what a lot of energy healers think they're doing. And it also fits with recent research on placebo responses. Now we've moved on from that sort of 20 or 30-year-old model, placebo's fake or phony and real medicine's real. It's not like that. Nobody thinks that anymore. It's a much more sophisticated and complex way of thinking now. And
well, they do still think that way. And there are holdouts, but yeah, but they're called, but they're called naysayers or so-called skeptics. And I mean, I just saw a recent article that you know, said, oh, it's placebo, and they still hang on to this idea that it's like, I mean, and you know, I get that if you're giving a drug or you're doing a procedure that costs time and money, risk, that it's reasonable to ask the question, does this give you some better bang for your buck than this thing that we call placebo? That's reasonable, it seems to me, because there's a lot of downside to it. But
yes, but I think that what you just said in your summary, that tapping or releasing traumas or releasing stress may release that capacity to heal. That makes complete sense to me. And the other thing is, you see that because of morphic resonance, which is about habits, it's morphic resonance says there's this inherent memory principle. It applies not just to inherited memories, it applies to our own memories, our habits, and our memories of what happened last week or last year or when we were children. I don't think these memories are all stored inside the brain. I think we resonate with ourselves in the past. And so we're constantly building up habits, our own habits. We need habits. We couldn't get by without them. You know, when you drive a car, you don't want to have to sort of go back to being a learner and saying, is this the gear lever and stuff? I mean, or which bit do you press to slow the car down and all that? These things happen completely unconsciously and automatically. They're habits. We need them. We need habits of emotional response, but some of our habits are dysfunctional and they don't serve us well. And they may be ones where we've responded in a fearful way to something that was truly fright-inducing in the past. But to go on responding in that way inappropriately may help to shut down our immune system, our healing capacities. So addressing memories, habits, and the point about habits is they're largely unconscious. In fact, they're mainly, habits basically are unconscious. And most of our memories are habits, unconscious memories. To somehow address those and release those is a key to healing. And after all, psychotherapists have been working on that principle ever since Freud. I mean, the 20th century psychotherapy was based on identifying harmful habits of emotional response, many of them built up during childhood. I mean, Freud thought most of them were built up before children were 4 years old, and these had a huge effect on their subsequent life. So there's nothing particularly radical in the idea that we have harmful habits or ones that could be dysfunctional.
No, the radical part is saying it's not in the body. That it's somehow around it. Is there? I'm curious. Is there any data that that you're aware of that supports this theory? I mean, it's an interesting theory.
Well, which theory? The idea
Well,
that memories.
the idea that it's somehow not in the body. You know, because somebody's going to say, well, you know, it's in the synapses or something. I mean, there's not a lot of proof of that.
No. Well, there have been many attempts to. I can't hear you anymore. Can you hear me all right?
I hear you fine.
Oh, good.
Okay, yeah.
I think the evidence is partly negative in the sense that people have tried to find the memory traces, and they have found that when cells, for example, in the hippocampus region of the brain are activated during learning process, they're also activated during the retrieval of memory. People often jump to the conclusion, well, that's where the memories are. But if the memory is a kind of resonant process that you resonate with yourself in the past, you would expect cells to be active when memories are being laid down. You would expect them to be active when memories are being retrieved. But what they haven't proved is that the memories are stored there. Right. So you see, like if I come to your house and turn on the TV set, and say you're looking at a PBS program, there's bits of the set are active when you're looking at that program. Turn the set off, come back another day, turn it off, you're looking at PBS again. I say they're active again. No, it doesn't prove that PBS is being stored there all the time in between. So attempts to find so-called long-term memory stores have been extremely fraught with problems. For example, years ago, about 20 years ago, they thought they'd found it in day-old chicks, the area that became active protein synthesis, long-term potentiation in the nerve cells of this particular region. They said, at last we found where memories are located for this form of learning. But then someone did a control experiment. A day later, they cut out that region of the brain and the chicks could still remember. So they said, oh, well, obviously the long-term memories have been moved in duplicate stores over large regions of the brain. It was that kind of evidence that caused Carl Pribram to talk of the holographic theory of memory storage, because the attempts to locate it, long-term memory in particular places, had failed. So
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think memory is mainly to do, loss of memory is mainly to do with the loss of ability to retrieve them rather than the memory, like in Alzheimer's, rather than the memories themselves being lost.
So would you say that Pribram's idea of a holographic memory is sort of a stepping stone to what you're saying? Or are you saying maybe it's holographic memory is the same as what you're hypothesizing?
Well, Pribram himself was ambiguous. I knew Pribram quite well. And sometimes when he was being more conservative, he'd say it was holographic sort of changes in the synapses all over the brain. It was inside the brain. But he became quite friendly with the physicist David Bohm, who thought kind of holographic memory storage in all space. And when Pribram was being more radical, he took the Bohm view, and Bohm and I knew each other quite well. And Bohm thought that what he called the holographic theory of what he called the hollow movement or the implicate order had a kind of memory within it very similar to what I'm saying about morphic resonance.
So you're, sorry, go ahead.
You could get him one day and he'd be more narrowly conventional, and the next day he'd be much more expansive and said, no, it's not in the brain at all.
So the idea that you're suggesting fits much closer with what physicist David Bohm was talking about in terms of implicate order, explicate order, and that the morphic field is more the implicate order, and that when you get a memory back or a habit pattern back, that is a sort of, the brain acts as a transducer, a transmitter, a television set into the explicate order.
Yes, that's right. And interestingly, the theoretical physicist Lee Smolin came out with the theory a couple of years ago, very similar to morphic resonance. He calls it the principle of precedence. If something's happened once in the universe, it's more likely to happen again. And the more often it happens, the more habitual it becomes. So the laws of nature are more like habits. So he's kind of reinvented morphic resonance in the context of contemporary theoretical physics and cosmology. And so, because he's said it, and
now it's more likely to happen because he said,
well, he himself is an example of, you know, helping a new habit to build up. And also, it's sort of somehow more acceptable to people to talk about if it comes from a theoretical physicist than if it comes from a biologist. So I'm quite happy he's moved this debate on in the world of physics.
Well, let me ask you about that, because you often get the, you know, people say, oh, it's quantum, and, you know, they use it, you know, often fairly loosely. Where do you think, from your perspective, so you have Lee Smolin, I've never heard of him, I'll have to look him up, you'll get me the reference, but
yeah.
is he and Bohm, are they considered are they still considered really radical and fringe in the physics world? Because I know there are some physicists who just, you know, I remember I saw, I think it was, I don't want to say the wrong name, but it was a well-known physicist ends up at the IONS conference. He just shows up to do his talk, and when he found out where he was, he freaked out. He was really unhappy about being with these people.
Mm.
So I'm just curious, from your perspective, like, where is this in terms of, from physicists? Is it a small number of folks? Is it a large number of folks? Where are we in the world of physics?
The thing, Bob, it's hard to know, because I find this the whole time myself, that what people say in private, what they say in public is quite different. I'm quite friendly with some of the most eminent people in the British science establishment. You know, I've known them since we were at Cambridge together, and we're good friends, we hang out, we discuss the things, but I don't sort of appear in public and say they're my friends, because I know it would compromise their official positions, and they don't appear in some public and back me up, because they get into unnecessary controversy.
I see.
So, a lot of people are very fearful. And now Lee Smolin is quite a brave physicist. He wrote a book called The Trouble with Physics, in which he argues that physics has taken a wrong turn, that it's now dealing with completely untestable theories like parallel universes and even dark matter and energy. I mean, these are meant to make up 95% of reality, and no one has a clue what they are. Dissident physicists, you see them as a minority, say they don't really exist. These are just a way of balancing the books or making up forms of matter and energy that there's no independent evidence for. Now, there's a lot that you can criticize about mainstream physics, and Smolin does that. He maintains his position as a respected member of the physics community. But I would say he was in a minority position, but maybe less of a minority than one might think, because he's prepared to speak out in public about this. And there are quite a few physicists who agree with him who won't speak out in public about it.
Perhaps we can shift gears and talk a little bit about, I know, you know, you had a book on these interesting experiments that people could do, because part of what, you know, we're hoping to help our you know, most clinicians, they don't think like scientists. And Bill Bankston in his talk, you know, talked a lot about, you know, the really clinicians and researchers actually have the same kinds of questions. To how much is dose and frequency, but you had, I know there's some studies that you have people can participate in now, just ways of thinking. Maybe if you could say a few words about how people can think, ask the kinds of hypotheses and questions that you come up with, these, you know, really interesting ways of thinking about things.
Okay, well, let me just mention two experiments that people can do, almost anyone can do. One is what I call a joint attention test. And that works online. It's on my website, sheldrake.org. And when you log on, you and a partner, another person, are connected together. And in a series of trials, you're shown a photograph and hear some music. About 50% of the time, you're seeing the same photo and hearing the same music as the other person. And about 50% of the time, you're seeing a different picture and hearing different music. And you have to guess after about 10 seconds whether your partner's looking at the same picture or not. Are your minds in resonance when you're looking at the same thing? Is there a kind of resonance between minds? We're getting positive, statistically significant results on this. It's a very simple experiment. the implications are enormous, because when people look at TV, you can have millions of people looking at the same thing. Does it make their minds resonate together? Does it feel different if you're watching a program live when millions of other people are watching it, compared with a recording when no one else may be watching it at that moment? I'm doing tests to test for that as well.
So this has significance, it seems to me, about along the lines of distance healing. Because if we could resonate on something like that, what if there are 100 people praying for somebody or something like that?
Yes, well, that would then tie in with another phenomenon that I'm looking at, which anyone can try, at least if they live in Britain, Canada, or the US. This one only works in a few countries. This is the telephone telepathy test. Can you tell when someone's thinking about you and about to call you? I mean, in real life, about 80% of people have had this experience. You think of someone for no apparent reason, the phone rings, you say, that's funny, I was just thinking about you. In this test, which works on cell phones or landlines, you sign on to the test. You have to have 2 other people to do it with. And in a random series of trials, one of them, A, let's say, is calling you, or it could be B. So you get a message saying, one of your 2 callers is on the line right now waiting to speak to you. Please guess who it is. Press 1 for A, press 2 for B. So you guess, and the line opens up, you get instant feedback, and then you do another trial. The whole test involves 6 trials. It takes about a quarter of an hour. It's fun, it's free. And that one is on my website too, the instructions, sheldrake.org, the telephone telepathy test. And finally, in terms of tests and this golden opportunity to reach out to people in energy medicine, there's one test I'm very keen on that I describe in my book, 7 Experiments That Could Change the World, which is with phantom limbs. You see, the official view of phantom limbs is that it's all in the brain. It's an illusion produced by changes in the motor cortex or the sensory cortex or something like that. And that when an amputee feels that their arm is real or their phantom leg is real, that's an illusion. It's actually in the head, not where it seems to be. I think that the phantom arm or the phantom leg is the field of the missing limb. And you now have a situation where you've got the field without the material part of the limb. That field can move around. It's where it seems to be, and that's what we're actually experiencing, I think, and what amputees are experiencing. So is there something really there in a phantom limb? Well, it turns out that phantoms go through solid objects being phantoms. If you ask an amputee to push their phantom arm through a table or a chair, they can just push it straight through. In this experiment, this is a very cheap, low-cost experiment. We have an amputee with a phantom arm on one side of the door, an opaque door. We mark 6 panels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, on both sides of the door. Then my assistant with the amputee throws a dice to pick a random number between 1 and 6, say it's 2. We then say to the amputee, please push your phantom arm through panel 2. So they push it through panel 2. Then on the other side, we have people who are experienced in subtle energy medicine or energy healing. One at a time, we test them. And we say, now here's this door. One of those panels has got a phantom arm sticking through it. The others haven't. Can you tell us which one's got the phantom arm? So they feel and they guess, and they say, well, I think it's number 2. And if they say that, they're right. If they say it's number 5, for example, they're wrong. By chance, they'd be right about 1 time in 6. In fact, they've been scoring significantly above chance. That's a terribly simple experiment, but it opens up the whole question of energy fields, or body fields. And the point about amputees is they provide this unique opportunity to separate the field from the body. Normally the 2 go together and you can't tease them apart, but they are teased apart in phantom limb phenomena.
Huh. All right, that's pretty interesting. I'm gonna have to think about that one. Well, I'm curious. Let me just ask you this: when you were talking about it, the experiment, not the treatment. I forget the guy's name. It's a long name, where he uses mirrors to help cure.
Oh, yes, Ramachandran.
Yes. what's your thoughts on that as it applies to morphic fields? I mean, of the arm, does that make sense? Does it totally? I mean, it seems to me that maybe it does.
Well, what Ramachandran does is he gets amputees and he sets them up so that they're seeing their intact arm, for example, in a mirror, so that it seems to be where the missing arm is.
Right.
So he manages to get them to fuse their subjective experience of the phantom limb with an image of the real limb.
Yeah.
This sort of enables them to relate to their phantom limb in a new way, and it sometimes helps to relieve phantom pain, which is a problem for a lot of amputees. I think what that's doing is somehow giving people a conscious experience of an intact body again. And this, I don't know how, I don't think he knows how, somehow changes the way they respond to their phantom. Now, Ramachandran is a very ingenious researcher. You know, he works in the US, he comes from an Indian background, he knows that to get on in the US, there's no point coming up with funny Indian ideas. So when he writes about it, his book's called Phantoms in the Brain. He takes the conventional materialist view that it's all just inside the head. And he actually has some evidence that in some cases, over time, rewiring of nerve connections in the head can affect phantoms. But his experiments are much more interesting than his standard materialist theory. And those ones with mirrors and arms are very ingenious. I think they're admirable experiments and useful too. And they provide a way of treating phantom pain which costs virtually nothing. So I think that's a huge plus.
Yeah, okay. So I'm still mulling over I hadn't heard this. And now is the phantom pain with the energy medicine, is that published yet, or you're still working on it?
No, well, I haven't dealt with phantom pain per se.
No, but the
phantom limb experiment.
Yeah,
yes, the one I've just described is one of the experiments in my book, 7 Experiments That Could Change the World.
Okay.
That book I published first in the 1990s. There's a new edition which has an update on the results.
Okay.
And the reason I published that particular book was I found it so hard to get grants for unconventional science. And also, I've been brought up in the British string and sealing wax tradition, you know, doing very inexpensive experiments. I set myself the challenge, can I come up with 7 paradigm-shattering experiments that would change the world that could be done on a budget of $10 or less? So instead of being frustrated by not being able to get a grant, you can do it without a grant. You can just do it. And 2 of those experiments grew into much bigger projects. One of them was on the sense of being stared at, and that led to a whole book. Another was on dogs that know when their owners are coming home, and that led to a whole book on that subject, a whole investigation of these responses of animals to human intentions at a distance, kind of telepathic responses. But the phantom limb one is the cheapest of all, really. Well, the staring experiments are virtually free as well. The phantom limb one hasn't been taken up by many people, and partly because they don't know about it, but I hope that some people who are watching us would be curious to do this, and all they need to do is find an amputee. It's easier with an arm than a leg for practical reasons.
Right.
But the rest of it, all you need is a door. Every house has got one of those, and a dice. I mean, they're virtually free, or a randomizing system on a computer or a smartphone. Anyway, these experiments can easily be done. They could easily be done for an MSc project or a student project, or they can just be done anyway. So I do hope someone will take this up. I think it would really move forward our discussion about fields and the nature of the fields of the body.
So are there any other, before we end today, are there any other thoughts you have about, or experiments? I think we've covered a lot of things we said we were going to talk about that have to do with fields or energy medicine that you think people, you want to underscore for folks?
I think there's now a lot of evidence that the practice, you know, what happens in our minds, what happens in affects what happens in our bodies. And I'm writing a new book at the moment called Science and Spiritual Practices. And one of the things that I'm very interested there is the evidence that's building up now for the benefits of various spiritual practices. I've already mentioned meditation, and there's now lots of studies on meditation, you know, the effects it has on calming people, better mental health, less depression, changes in the brain when people are meditating. It's so much so that meditation's, at least in Britain, no longer controversial. You know, it's, as I mentioned, available on prescription on the National Health Service. Now, the other practices include prayer. And there's now, I think, overwhelming evidence that people who pray on a regular basis get less depressed, feel more connected, feel better, have better mental health than those who don't. Now, I'm not talking here about studies about does the prayer really work? You know, if I pray for someone to get better in Texas, do they actually get better? There have been studies of that kind. Some work, some don't. The problem with those is the control group, the not prayed for group, are only people who are not being prayed for in the experiment. You can't really go to Texas and say to somebody, that's where some of these experiments were done, look, your mom's in here really sick, she's in the not prayed for group, so all the family, all your church, just stop praying for her because she's the non. What they're actually doing is comparing, probably everyone's being prayed for, and they're adding on a bit of prayer from strangers a long way away, and sometimes it may have an effect, but sometimes it doesn't. I'm now talking about prayer, the effect of prayer on the person who prays. The sense in anyone who prays has a sense they're in connection with a spiritual reality, and people pray to all sorts of different, you know, God, the Holy Spirit, saints, the Blessed Virgin Mary, angels, plant spirits, the sun. I mean, there's all sorts of ways of praying, but all of them involve the sense that one's connected to something larger than oneself. And that sense of connection, that sense of conversation has an enormously helpful effect for a lot of people. And this is reflected in the fact that people who pray regularly tend to live longer, suffer from less from depression, recover better from illnesses or injuries, and so forth. Again, this is one of the things that people might in the past, and probably the skeptics and naysayers still say today, well, that's nothing but the placebo effect. But the fact is, if it helps people live longer, lead better lives, etc., this is something that's really relevant to medicine. It's not irrelevant. So anyway, some of the things I'm working on at the moment are studies that show that traditional religious practices, or even non-traditional ones, rituals and so on, can have beneficial effects on people's health. I personally think that militant atheism and militant skepticism should come with a health warning, because if we look at it the other way around, if all these spiritual practices benefit health, then attacking them and not doing them harms health. And
we got data. We have two different groups. Do we have data on this, or?
Well, yes, we've got data on. The data are usually formulated in the form of those who pray, as if prayer's just added on to a baseline non-praying. But actually, historically speaking, most people have prayed. What's the new phenomenon is people who don't pray. You know, atheists or agnostics who feel that any kind of religious practice is beneath them and just something that only superstitious people do, and they've risen above it. That's what's new in the world. Everywhere else in the world, even today, most people pray. And even in America today, even in England, which is much more secular and atheistic than America, at least half the population pray, even though not many of them go to church or synagogue or anything. It's still a very common practice. So the fact that some people don't do it is what these studies look at, but they frame it that here's the kind of control group, don't do it, and then prayer's kind of added on. But actually, what I'm saying is that when we just invert the way we look at it, praying is much more normal and baseline. And the don't not praying group are people who've subtracted prayer. And the result is that they live less long, get more depressed, don't recover so well from diseases. So that, which is why I think that atheism in its militant forms, moderate atheism is reasonably fine in my view, but militant atheism combined with this kind of dogmatic skepticism, I think actually harms people. And I think the evidence suggests, the scientific evidence suggests that that's the case.
Well, that's a provocative statement. I guess if it was an experiment, we ought to have three groups, right? We have the people that do a lot of praying, the people who sort of don't do much, but aren't all that, they just don't care. And then there's the, the militant skeptics and anti folks. Do they do even worse? Is it like a negative effect? I don't
know. No one's done that experiment, but I think it would be a good one to do. And because right now, the militant skeptics have got away with pretending that they represent normal, baseline, rational human behavior. Actually, when we see that this is actually a minority with a particular ideological fixation that could have health consequences, as well as causing narrow-mindedness and a blindness to scientific evidence, as you've discovered and I've discovered. And I think we see it, we just look at it the other way around, and it makes more sense that way.
Well, let's close this one thought that's maybe a little more lyrical. I was thinking of, as you were talking, and I was thinking about morphic fields as a concept, and then there's, you're talking about connection. And it seems to me that, depending on your culture, your language, you say things differently, but this idea of connection certainly has been a connection to something bigger than oneself. Is really a spiritual tradition that goes back, as long as we've been around. Might not it be that the concept of connecting to a morphic field or morphic fields or fields within fields be sort of the same idea of connecting to this unseen realm that maybe earlier man and woman had some better sense of, that we've not really, we've lost in the modern age?
I think so. I mean, and even just ordinary conventional science points to that. I mean, we as humans are part of an ecosystem. The ecosystem is part of Gaia, the whole living planet, which is clearly more than human. And it's been here a lot longer than humans, and it's more than human. We totally depend on it. And that's part of the solar system, which has its own morphic field, I would say, the field of the whole. The morphic field is that which makes a whole more than the sum of the parts. And the solar system is more than the sum of the parts. It's like a huge organism. And that in turn is part of the galaxy, and the galaxy is part of the entire cosmos. At every one of these levels, there's a morphic field that organizes that level. And all morphic fields have fields within fields. So solar systems are like organisms within the galaxy, like cells in the body. The stars, the billions of stars in our galaxy are like cells in the body of the galaxy. And each of those cells is a solar system with planets and so forth. And each of those has more, like the whole ecosystem. The Earth has lots of different species and societies, and all of those have individuals with organs and tissues and cells. That's the way nature is. It's holistically organized. And the idea there's a privileged level of organization, which is the individual autonomous human being, or at the physical level, the atom. That is what people thought in the 17th century, the beginning of atomism in Western thought, at least since the scientific revolution. It revived Greek atomism. But extreme individualism is, I think, harmful for individuals and for society, because it disconnects them from the social groups that we all need. And atomism in physics hasn't worked out either, because it turns out the atom isn't the ultimate indivisible unit. It's made up of protons and electrons, and the protons go on dividing into ever more subparticles depending on however the biggest, latest atom smasher. The limit is set not by nature herself, but by the willingness of the US and European governments to go on funding ever bigger colliders. And ironically, reductionist science has the thing that the smaller the thing you're looking at, the bigger and more expensive the apparatus you need. The good news for those involved in holistic research is that holistic science, by looking at things at their own level, is generally speaking a great deal cheaper.
Well, Rupert, I think this is a great place to end. I want to thank you for your time. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Bob. I've much enjoyed it.